On the cold evening of December 25, 1991, the winter wind swept through a quiet red square in Moscow. At 7 p.m., Mikhail Gorbachev sat before television cameras and resigned as Soviet president. Minutes later, the red hammer and sickle flag that had flown above the Kremlin for decades was lowered into the dark for the final time. For nearly 70 years, this state had stood as a geopolitical titan. It mobilized a command economy to defeat Nazi Germany, launched the first satellite into space, and maintained a nuclear arsenal that terrified the West. And then it vanished. A silent internal rot had been hollowing out the empire's foundations for decades, ultimately bringing the superpower down from within. To understand the fall, you have to look at the empire at the peak of its power. Outwardly, the Soviet Union projected an aura of invincibility, with a massive transcontinental footprint and a formidable military apparatus. Under the leadership of Leonid Brezhnev, the period from the mid-1960s to the early 1980s was officially celebrated as an era of stability. Today, historians refer to it as the era of stagnation. This document outlines a structural flaw in the command economy. The state prioritized a massive military budget while neglecting consumer goods and technological innovation. Growth rates, which had surged in the post-war years, plummeted toward zero. For the average Soviet citizen, macroeconomic failure translated into daily exhaustion. Citizens spent hours waiting in line just to secure basic necessities like bread or winter boots. To survive, people turned to an expansive black market to find what the state could not provide. A cynical social contract developed between the government and the workforce, captured by the local motto, "We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us." While the empire looked imposing on a world map, its economic core had eroded. The vast military machinery was resting on a society that could no longer support its weight. That fragile balance cracked in December 1979, when the Soviet military invaded Afghanistan. What leaders anticipated would be a brief stabilization mission devolved into a grueling 10-year military stalemate. The conflict became a bleeding wound for the Soviet treasury. At a time when the civilian economy was already struggling to stay afloat, billions of rubles were siphoned off to sustain an unwinnable war. As the casualties mounted, bitter factionalism divided the government in Moscow. The KGB advocated for maintaining a heavy presence to secure their political clients, while the Soviet army, bearing the cost in human lives, pushed for a withdrawal. The failure to defeat the Mujahideen damaged the Communist Party's moral authority at home and shattered the military's carefully cultivated image of global supremacy. The war in Afghanistan acted as a systemic catalyst. It took a slow economic decline and accelerated it into an active political crisis that the rigid Soviet system could no longer absorb. When Mikhail Gorbachev took power as General Secretary in 1985, he inherited this fractured state. He intended to save and modernize Soviet communism, believing the system could be reformed. This excerpt details his radical pillars of reform: perestroika, meaning economic restructuring, and glasnost, political openness designed to raise efficiency. But these solutions proved disastrous. The 1987 law on socialist enterprises created a loophole for executives to siphon off state assets for private gain. While the economy was being cannibalized, glasnost was dismantling state censorship. For the first time, citizens were permitted to openly criticize the government's failures and historical misdeeds. This sudden freedom of speech removed the primary mechanism keeping the empire together: fear. Long-suppressed nationalist movements rapidly mobilized, and waves of independence protests swept across Eastern Europe and the Soviet republics. Gorbachev's reforms acted as a fatal cure. By aggressively treating the symptoms of stagnation, he inadvertently killed the host. By August 1991, the central government was losing its grip. To prevent a planned treaty that would decentralize the USSR into a loose federation, a group of Soviet hardliners attempted to take control. In what became known as the August Push, a committee dubbed the Gang of Eight placed Gorbachev under house arrest, and then rolled their tanks into Moscow to seize the capital by force. They were met with immediate resistance. Russian President Boris Yeltsin defied the coup plotters, standing outside the Russian parliament building to rally the public. The coup collapsed within days because the security apparatus fractured. Crucial elements of the military and the KGB refused orders to fire on their own citizens, shifting their loyalty toward Yeltsin's Russian Republic. Yeltsin immediately retaliated. He suspended and then entirely banned the Communist Party of the Soviet Union from operating on Russian soil, stripping the central state of its institutional backbone. The hardliners had launched their coup to preserve the Soviet Union. Instead, their use of force shattered whatever central authority remained. The failed coup triggered a rapid chain reaction. Over the next few months, almost all of the Soviet republics declared complete independence from Moscow. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met to sign the Belavezha Accords, legally dissolving the USSR. Gorbachev was left completely powerless. When he gave his resignation speech weeks later, he was the president of a country that effectively no longer existed. The bipolar order of the Cold War dissolved as the Soviet landmass fractured into 15 separate nations, redrawing the global map in a single stroke. The Soviet collapse proves that no amount of nuclear warheads, imposing borders, or secret police can sustain a superpower once its foundations have rotted away.